All right, so now that we've completed designing our user interface, we're finally ready to start doing some programming. And we're going to be writing some code to allow us to change some of the properties of those user interface elements that we've added earlier on. Now, we already know that when we select any of these user interface elements, such as these image views or the button, we can head over to the attribute inspector and change its properties. So, for example, if I wanted this leftmost image view to show the dice 2 image rather than the dice 1 image, all I have to do is to select the user interface element that I want to change, which is this one right here. And then I can simply type a different image. So for example, I want it to show dice 2. Well, then I would tell it that the image for this image view should be dice 2 instead of dice 1. But if you imagine that our app is already running on a user's iPhone, say a million miles away, because they downloaded it from the App Store, we can't then get a copy of their app and change it in Xcode and then send them the new version, right? This doesn't work. So in our main.storyboard, we're essentially designing all the components that need to be on the screen. And while we're designing it, we're able to change a lot of these properties. But if we need to change these properties on the fly while the app is running, then we're going to have to resort to code. So let's change this back to our dice 1. And let's figure out how we can do exactly the same thing, but using only our code. So firstly, our code file is going to be this one, the viewcontroller.swift. And when you create any Xcode project, it always comes with some template code for you to get started with. Now, notice how these are actually two completely separate files. The viewcontroller.swift is our code file, and the main.storyboard is our design file. Now, given that we can only write our code in this viewcontroller file, how can we access the components in the main.storyboard file? Well, here's where something called the assistant editor comes in handy. So if you open up the main.storyboard and head over to the right corner, here you see a number of lines and we can adjust the editor options. So if you click on it, you can go ahead and select the assistant view. What this means is that we have our design file on the left. So if you take a look up here, you can see that we're inside the Dicey iOS 13 project and inside the main.storyboard file. But on the right here, you can see that it's automatically figured out that the companion code file is the viewcontroller.swift file. So that's what's showing on the right. In order for us to be able to refer to specific user interface elements in our design file, we have to create something that's called a IB outlet or an interface builder outlet. So this main.storyboard is also known as the interface builder because we're using it to build the user interface. And so in order to create our IB outlet, all we have to do is to hold down the control button on our keyboard, not the command button. And then we're going to click on the image view, dice 1, and then we're going to drag it over to our code file. Now, make sure that you don't let go until you're ready to drop it. And the place where we want to put it is just below this class view controller on line 11 and before this override function view did load. So anywhere between 11 and 13. And then we're going to let go and we get a pop-up asking us what name we should give this connection. Now, this is going to be the name that we'll use in our code file to refer to this specific image view. I'm going to call it the dice image view 1. Now, notice the way that I've named this. I've started with a word that is completely lowercase, and then every subsequent word has the first letter capitalized. Now, why do we do this? This is a really easy way of being able to see where each word ends and the next one begins. And you'll see this pretty much commonly across all programming languages, not just in Swift. So if we go ahead and click Connect, then you'll see that we've created an interface builder outlet. So it's a way for us to be able to access this particular user interface element by referring to the name that we gave it, which is Dice Image View 1. Now, this particular way of naming things is called camel casing in programming. Think about a camel and its humps, then you might be able to, with a lot of imagination, see that the first word should be lowercase and every subsequent word is a hump, so it needs to be capitalized. This means that programmers can avoid those situations like those long Twitter hashtags where you can't really tell what it says because all the words are lowercase and you don't know where it starts and where it ends. And similarly, for stationary websites, which are called Pen Island, you will have less issues if you were able to keep it camel-cased. Now, coming back to these connections created from the design file to the code file, or these interface builder connections like this one that we just created, they are a really common source of errors, especially for beginners. So let's say that we've created this IB outlet, and at some point I've decided, you know what, actually I've made a typo. And now I want to make it read Dice Image View 1, but instead of 1, I want to use the actual word. So now I'm looking at my code and it looks great and there's no errors. But when I actually run my app right now, you'll see that your app will crash. And this is what it looks like. It'll say something like signal sigbart, and down here you'll get a whole bunch of stuff being outputted. But if you scroll right to the top, it says terminating app because of this reason. And the reason is because something is not key value coding compliant for the key Dice Image View 1. So looking at this clue, we should be reminded that previously we had something in here called Dice Image View 1 with that number at the end, but we changed it, right, in the code. Now, what you don't know is that behind the scenes, when we create each of these outlets, there's actually code that's being written in the main.storyboard. And you can view it by right-clicking and opening as source code. So if we scroll right to the bottom, you can see that one of the connections has a reference to something called Dice Image View 1. So that old spelling there. And because we changed it here, it can no longer find it inside this file, which is why your app crashes with this particular error code. So I recommend getting really used to seeing this particular type of error when your app crashes and looking at what it is that it has a problem with. So when you do have this issue, then what you want to do is to simply right click and just delete this connection. And now when you run your app, even though this connection is now broken, it won't crash. You can relink it by simply starting from the circle and pointing it back to the element you want to link it to. But in the future, if you actually want to rename one of these outlets or anything else you name for that matter, the best way is to simply right click on it. And if you're new to Mac, that means holding down the Control key on your keyboard and clicking on this, and then go to Refactor Rename. And in this case, it's going to pick up all of the places where this word is used, including the main.storyboard as well as the viewcontroller.swift. And now if you rename it, it will make the changes everywhere where this name is used. So now when you click rename, then you've done it safely, and when you run your app, it won't crash. So just keep in mind this point when you encounter these problems. And remember that when your app crashes, you can always scroll to the very top of the debug area and look at what the reason is. The most useful parts are at the top here. And here it tells you this particular reason. So when you look at the reason, you can exclude all the parts that are unique to your app, for example, the name of your app and the particular instance, etc., and look at the message. So it says something about this class is not key value coding compliant for this key. Now, this is the same message that it's going to tell everybody that has this problem. So if you go ahead and just copy it and paste it into Google, then you'll find that other people have encountered the same problem, in fact, more than 1,000 people, and you'll see people's explanations and solutions for how to solve these problems. Coming back to our code, we've got this line of code that's been written automatically by Xcode when we simply control dragged and dropped it inside our code file, linking the two files together. When you hover over this little circle, you can see that it's now highlighting the particular element that's actually linked to this particular name. So we can now use this name and change the properties of this particular image view. And the place where we're going to do it is inside the curly braces of this thing called viewDidLoad. Now, this is what we would call a block of code. And it's essentially a bunch of lines of code. Say currently it's got 2 lines of code inside the block, and they're all going to be activated depending on a condition. Well, in this case, the condition is when the view loads up. So when your app first shows up on the phone. And what we want to do is we want to change one of the properties of this dice image view 1 when the view loads up. So right now you can see that in our design, we've got the first dice image showing up, so dice1.png, but I want to be able to show, say, dice 6 as soon as my app loads up. In order to do that, I can use the dot notation. The way that we would write our code is who needs to be changed, dot, what property about this thing needs to change, and finally, after an equal sign, we set the new value, so what it should be changed to. So let's try and apply this. In this case, the who is going to be the dice image view 1, so this one right here. And so we're going to type dice image view 1. And you can see that as soon as I start typing, Xcode is going to search through all the possibilities and bring the most likely possibilities up to the top. And indeed, this is exactly the one I wanted to type. So now you can hit either the Tab key or the Enter key for it to insert automatically. And it's a really good idea to use auto-completion with Xcode because it means that you don't make silly mistakes like typos where you have a V here or you have an O here. And another way to tell if you've made a typo is that when you have an actual piece of code that is recognizable by Xcode, it gets highlighted in a different color once you've finished typing it. In this case, it's this sort of dark sea green. But if you make a typo, say I had a lowercase v instead of uppercase v, it doesn't know what it is. And it will give you an error telling you use of unresolved identifier, which means I have never seen this thing. I don't know what you're talking about. Check your spelling. So that's another potential downfall that you can avoid by simply using autocomplete. Now we've got the who we want to change, and then we add a dot and we tell it what we want to change about this thing. And in fact, as soon as you write the dot, Xcode actually gives you a whole bunch of things that you can choose from to change, so all the possibilities, but it's a little bit overwhelming. The easier way to do this is to pop open the attribute inspector again and select the element that we want to change, that image view, and then just simply look at the names of all the properties. So you've got this thing called image, you've got this thing called content mode or alpha or background, and we can use that name here as well as the what. So the what that we want to change in this case is actually that image property. So after the dot, I'm simply going to write image. And you can see that Xcode also tells me that this is perfectly legal. There is indeed something called image I can change. And down here, it gives you a brief description of what it will do. So by setting this image property, I will change the image displayed in the image view, which sounds pretty much exactly like what we want to do, right? And if I scroll around, then you can see that for each of these different properties, it tells me what it will do when I try to change it. But I want to change the image. Now I've got the who I want to change. After the dot, I've got the what I want to change. And finally, I'm going to add an equal sign and tell it what is the value. What do I want to change it to? So in my case, I want to change it to the dice 6 image. So this one right here. Now, how can I tell it to change it to that image? Well, there's something really handy called an image literal. And that allows us to define the actual literal image that we want to set as the value of this image view. I'm going to start typing and I'm going to write image literal. So all one word, and you can see that we've got the image literal being suggested to us. Once that's highlighted, either you can double click on it or you can simply toggle around and hit enter. And now we have a little image that we can select. So if you double click on it, then it pops up with all the possibilities that you can choose from. And I'm going to select the 6th dice to put in there. So now we've set the who, the what, and finally the value. And if I run my app right now, once my view loads up, this block of code will trigger. And one of the instructions in that block is to change my dice image view 1, this one, its image property to dice 6. And you can see that as soon as my app launches, that's exactly what it does. And even though the first dice is shown in our design, but in fact, when our app launches, we see dice 6 because we changed it in our code. Now, another important thing to highlight at this point is what we mean by a block of code, or when I say write something inside a particular block of code. What does it mean to be inside? So here we have the same view did load, and you can see that in between these curly braces, this is where the code will go. So it's a case of when the view loads up, then trigger all the code in between the curly braces. But often you will have lots of lines of code, and it gets a bit confusing if we had to extend it really, really far out this way to keep it all on one line. So often the formatting you'll see in any programming language is something like this, where you have the block of code enclosed again by curly braces, but the curly braces are now split across multiple lines. But notice that when the brace faces right, that's the opening part, that's the start of the block. And when you see a curly brace facing left, then that's the end of the block of code. And everything in between these two curly braces are the code that will be triggered. And in Xcode, there's 2 really helpful tips. One is if you find the closing brace and you just go left and right on it, it will flash to you where the corresponding open brace is. Alternatively, if you double click on the closing brace, it'll actually highlight the entire block. So these are all the lines of code that will be triggered when the view loads up. Now, don't worry too much about some of these other keywords for now, like weak or override or super. We're going to go through them when we have enough knowledge to understand what they do. But all that we need to know right now is this particular block of code will trigger when the view loads up, and we can add as many lines of code as we want into the block in order for the code to happen when the view loads up. So currently, we're just setting the image of the image view. So here's a challenge. I want you to change the alpha property of this image view. So if we go into the attribute inspector after we select this particular image view, and I go to the alpha section, this refers to the transparency. So 1 means it's completely opaque and 0 means it's completely transparent. I want you to set it to 0.5, so half transparency. How can you do this but not using the attribute inspector? By using the code. So keeping in mind the who.what equals value format and keeping in mind what particular property we want to change, try and complete this challenge. If you have managed to successfully complete the challenge, you should be able to see that left-sided image view dim to about half its original opacity, at least compared to the right side, as soon as you launch the app. But in the main.storyboard, you should still see it fully opaque and the alpha property should still be 1. So it's all dependent on your code. Now, I recommend giving these challenges a real good try because these are the moments where you learn. It's not watching tutorials, it's actually giving it a go yourself. But once you're done, and if you want to check your solution against mine, then head over to the course links and there will be a link to a solution file on GitHub. And you can scroll through it to see the actual solution and compare it against yours. The next challenge is to set the image of the right-sided dice view. by creating an IB outlet called Dice Image View 2. Try and think about what you learned in this lesson and change this image to Dice 2, the second dice image, which is this one, when it loads up, but make sure it still shows Dice 1 in your main.storyboard, and it's only when you run the app does it change that to Dice 2. And apply what you learn about the who.what equals value equation and see if you can complete this challenge. And here's the solution. Just as before, we're going to hold down Control and click and drag to underneath the previous line, and we're going to give this one the same name other than the final number, which is Dice Image View 2. And we're going to click Connect. So now we have a reference to that right-sided image view as well as the left. And when our view loads up, we can also tap into the right side, so the Dice Image View 2, and change its image. And we're going to change it to another image literal, but this time we're going to double click and select the Dice 2 image. So now when I run my app, I'm expecting the left one to show the Dice 6, right one to show Dice 2, and that's exactly what I see. Perfect. While you're learning, it might be helpful to write some comments for your future self in case you take a break and you come back to your code a month later and all of this starts looking like it's a foreign language again, even though right now you know exactly what's going on. The way that programmers do this is through commenting. So we would write 2 forward slashes, and notice how everything I type now will become grayed out, so not interpreted as code. And this allows us to leave notes for our future self or for other people who we're collaborating with. So for example, I might say that an IB outlet allows me to reference a UI element, and then maybe down here I'll write something like this is the who, and then this is the what, and this is the value. This really depends on you. From person to person, people will leave different comments, but a well-commented piece of code might make the code look a bit longer, but it does mean that it's easier to understand exactly what's going on without having to spend a lot of brain power trying to piece it together. Feel free to leave comments to yourself as you go along, but in order to keep the code not overflow, given that I've got such a large font size, I'm actually going to delete these and change all of that back. And we've now learned about changing things in our user interface programmatically. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can detect user interaction and respond to it appropriately. For all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.